The night was dark and heavy, the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I was at home, trying to relax after a long day. The phone rang, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. I picked it up, my heart already racing. It was a call I never wanted to receive. "Dr. Nick, it's Sunny. You need to come to Graceland right away. Elvis isn't doing well." My hands shook as I grabbed my medical bag and rushed out the door. The drive to Graceland was a blur. I remember the streetlights flickering past, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. I rushed up the stairs to Elvis's room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Elvis was lying on his bed, his face pale and his breathing shallow. He looked so fragile, so far from the vibrant man I knew. I could feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had to save him, I had to. I began my examination, checking his vitals, listening to his heart, trying to find the source of the problem. His pulse was weak, and his skin was clammy. I could see the fear in his eyes, but he tried to stay calm, to trust me. I gave him a dose of medication to stabilize him, but I knew it was only a temporary fix. There was more to this than just a simple ailment. As I worked, I couldn't help but think about our history. How we had met, how our friendship had grown, and how much he meant to me. Elvis wasn't just a patient. He was a friend, a brother. I had seen him through some of the toughest times of his life, and he had been there for me too. But that night, it felt like everything was slipping away. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the sound of Elvis's labored breathing. His eyes met mine, and I could see the trust, the hope that he placed in me. I couldn't let him down. I called for an ambulance, knowing that he needed more intensive care. As the paramedics arrived, I stayed by his side, holding his hand, trying to reassure him. "You're going to be okay, Elvis, I promise." But deep down, I wasn't sure. The fear in his eyes mirrored the fear in my own heart. I knew that this was more than just a physical battle. It was a fight for his life. The ambulance ride to Baptist Memorial Hospital was a blur. I sat next to Elvis, monitoring his condition, giving him additional doses of medication. The hospital staff was waiting for us, ready to take over. They wheeled him into the emergency room, and I followed, feeling helpless and overwhelmed. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses rushed around, trying to stabilize Elvis. I stood back, watching, praying, hoping that they could save him. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, one of the doctors approached me, his face grave. "Dr. Nick, we've done everything we can. His condition is critical. We need to do everything possible to keep him alive." I nodded, my mind racing with thoughts and prayers. I knew that this was a defining moment, not just for Elvis, but for me. I had to be strong for both of us. As I stood there, I realized that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The night had changed everything, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But I was determined to be there for Elvis, no matter what. Because no matter how famous he was still just a man, and he needed me. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It was a hot Memphis afternoon, and I was at the hospital, about to leave when my pager started beeping. The hospital intercom called out my name, Dr. Nichopoulos, Dr. George Nichopoulos. I knew something was wrong. I answered the call, and it was Joe, Elvis's road manager. His voice was frantic. "Dr. Nick, you need to get to Graceland quick. Something's happened to Elvis." I rushed to my car, my mind racing. Elvis had been doing well, but he was under a lot of stress. His girlfriend, Ginger, had refused to go on tour with him, and he was upset about it. I had talked to him the night before, and he sounded nervous, almost rambling. He mentioned wanting to play racquetball, and I thought it might help him relax. But now I was worried. What if he had overexerted himself? What if it was something more serious? I sped to Graceland, praying the whole way. When I arrived, I saw the ambulance already there. My heart sank. I ran over and climbed into the back of the ambulance. Elvis was on a gurney, and his face was swollen and blue. He wasn't breathing, and his heart had stopped. I took charge, trying to figure out what was happening. We tried to intubate him, but it was difficult. His tongue was badly bitten, and there were carpet fibers in his mouth. It was clear he had struggled. We continued to try to revive him, but it was no use. The EMT and I gave chest compressions and administered medications, but nothing worked. The situation was getting more desperate by the minute. When we finally reached Baptist Memorial Hospital, the Harvey team took over. They tried everything they could, but Elvis remained unresponsive. I watched the monitors, hoping for any sign of life, but there was nothing. The time seemed to stretch on forever. The doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, but eventually they looked to me. I knew what I had to do. In a voice barely above a whisper, I said, "Stop CPR, he's gone." The room fell silent. The staff slowly stepped back, and I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had to tell Elvis's father and his friends. I walked into the room where they were waiting. Their faces were full of hope, but when they saw me, they knew. I told them, "It's all over, he's gone." The room erupted in sobs. I could barely hold it together myself. Losing Elvis was like losing a part of me. I had been his doctor for so long, and we were more than just patient and doctor. We were friends. I had to stay strong for everyone, but inside I was shattered. In those moments, I realized how much Elvis meant to so many people. He wasn't just a superstar, he was a brother, a friend, and a son. His death left a void that could never be filled. But even in my grief, I knew that his legacy would live on. Elvis had touched the lives of millions, and his music would continue to inspire generations to come. I stood there in the quiet of Grandma Minnie-Me's room, surrounded by the Presley family and the people who loved Elvis. There were so many tearful faces, all of us waiting and praying. Vernon and his fiancée, Sandy Miller, were there, along with Elvis's Aunt Delta Biggs, who lived at Graceland and managed the domestic staff. 2 of the maids were there too, along with other relatives and employees who worked or lived on the property. The instant I walked through the door, Vernon knew. His eyes widened and he moaned, "Oh no, no." The entire room began to weep, every single person in it. It was the most heart-wrenching scene I had ever witnessed. People were crying and wailing, just like in those old Greek funerals. After a few moments, I knew it was time to make the call. I walked slowly past the kitchen, where I could see a crowd gathering outside the stone walls. I picked up the phone in the entry hall, dreading what was to come, and dialed the hospital. "Joe," I said, my voice heavy with resignation, "you can give the press its story." We then moved to the den where we had a big TV. We braced ourselves for the formal news report from the press conference at the hospital. The room was silent as we watched the screen, each of us processing the reality of losing Elvis in our own way. Even when trusted news sources read the bulletin, many people thought it was a hoax. They had to hear the words again and again before it sank in. Elvis Presley, the 42-year-old king of rock and roll, died today in Memphis, Tennessee. Vernon appeared subdued after the official report. I asked if I could examine him, and was relieved to find he had no chest pains. He was surprisingly coherent and focused, as ready as he could be under such dire circumstances. Next, we had to discuss the need for an autopsy. Dick Grob arrived from the hospital, and we explained everything to Vernon. We told him that the medical examiner would need to determine if Elvis's death was from natural causes, suicide, or foul play. If it was natural, the body would be released to the family, and we could request an autopsy. We all agreed we wanted the autopsy done to find out exactly what had happened. Vernon's hand was shaky as he signed the necessary papers. Dick Grob, Graceland's security chief, was a former FBI and CIA agent and a former Air Force pilot. Elvis was fascinated by law enforcement, and Dick's background made him a trusted friend. He had already taken action, stopping Elvis's musicians from leaving Nashville and bringing the advance team back to Memphis. His efficiency gave me a better understanding of why Elvis and Vernon trusted him so much. The official team arrived to examine the death scene. Dan Warlick, the chief medical investigator, was young but competent. His team included Dr. Jerry Francisco, the county's chief medical examiner, and several detectives. They searched Elvis's room and found no drugs, only 2 syringes commonly used by dentists. The room had been cleaned, and the carpet where Elvis had fallen had been scrubbed. The detectives interviewed everyone who had been upstairs during and after the tragedy. They learned where Elvis was lying when he was found and measured the distance from that spot to the cleaned area on the carpet. The maids told them that they always cleaned Elvis's room first thing when he left the house, which explained the cleaning. After the interview, my son Dean, who worked as an aide and helped with security, gave me a ride back to the hospital. He was eager to tell me what had happened at Graceland after Elvis was taken away. Elvis went upstairs with Ginger around 1:30 a.m., Dean began. He called you on the phone and then talked with Joe about tour details. Later, he met with Dick to go over security plans. After that, he asked Billy and Joe to play racquetball with him and Ginger. When they got back, Elvis was hot and sweaty. He just wanted some ice water. Ginger and Billy went upstairs, and Billy dried Elvis's hair. When Billy left, Elvis called for Rick, but no one could find him. Elvis called your office, and Tish gave him some sleep medicine. Delta took it upstairs with ice water. Elvis started reading but couldn't sleep, so he went into the bathroom to read without bothering Ginger. It was around 9 in the morning. Ginger woke up around 2 in the afternoon and called her mom. When she hung up, she checked on Elvis. She found him lying face down on the carpet and called for help. Al called Joe, and Joe called Vernon. Before the ambulance arrived, everyone was trying to get Elvis breathing. Sandy gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation until the EMT arrived. Dean paused for a moment, then continued, "Something went wrong. Rick was supposed to be on duty until noon, and David was supposed to relieve him. But where were they when Elvis needed them? The maids heard a loud thump around 1 o'clock, but no one checked on Elvis. If David had been there, he would have heard the noise and checked. Also, the maids saw the buttons on the phone light up a few times and heard the shower running in the bathroom. They were confused because Ginger was fully dressed and had perfect makeup when she called for help. It usually takes her at least an hour to get ready. What do you make of that?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew we needed to find out what really happened. The autopsy would hopefully give us some answers. I was still reeling from all the new information when I answered Dean. "All I know is that Elvis called me this morning about his tooth hurting. He asked if I could give him something for the pain, but I didn't have my medical bag at home, so I told him I'd write a prescription. He said Rick would come to get it. I called the hospital's all-night pharmacy to let them know Rick was coming. That's the last time I saw Rick at our house this morning around 2:30. Dean looked at me, his face serious. How did the talk with the investigator go? That was Dan Warlick. He wanted to know why there were no medicine bottles in Elvis's bedroom or bathroom. I explained that we gave Elvis his medications in envelopes to control his intake and to prevent him from accidentally overdosing on sleeping pills. I told Warlick that as far as I knew, the pills Elvis took this morning were the ones I had prescribed, unless the dentist gave him something earlier. Dean nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The maid said Vernon asked if they had seen David or Rick on the back stairs. Why would Vernon want to know that? Doesn't it seem strange? Before I could answer, we arrived at the hospital. The atmosphere inside the hospital was tense. Dick had delivered the signed form authorizing the autopsy, and an assistant attorney general was still waiting outside the room where Elvis's body lay. He was there in case the coroner decided to take the body to the city hospital for an autopsy. But the medical examiner's office had ruled Elvis's death as natural causes, so the hospital pathologists were free to proceed with the private autopsy. The difference between a hospital autopsy and a coroner's autopsy is significant. Hospital pathologists are more focused on clinical aspects, while coroner's pathologists are trained in forensic science. The hospital pathologists would collect the data, and Dr. Francisco, the coroner, would make the final ruling on the cause of death. Before the autopsy began, the hospital pathologists and the medical examiner's office agreed to work together. Dr. Eric Muirhead, the hospital's chief of pathology, would supervise the initial examination. Dr. Jerry Francisco would be there as a consultant, along with his team, including Dan Warlick, who had investigated the scene at Graceland. I was there to observe and learn as much as I could about what had happened to Elvis. I wondered if he was already dead when the ambulance left Graceland. Joe had said he heard Elvis breathe, so I assumed he was still alive when we left. As the autopsy team gathered, I could sense the tension between Dr. Muirhead and Dr. Francisco. I hoped their differences wouldn't affect the investigation. Dan Warlick started the initial examination, looking for any signs of trauma or injection sites. He was thorough, and I took notes, knowing I'd need to review everything later. The team continued their examination, checking for any signs of a ruptured aneurysm or blood clots, but they found nothing. Most causes of sudden death were ruled out. Dr. Francisco agreed to a press conference to give the media an update. We walked into the room where the reporters were waiting, and Dr. Francisco made the announcement. The cause of death is cardiac arrhythmia due to undetermined causes. There is no evidence of drug abuse. The other doctors remained silent, and I could see their discomfort. I later learned that Dr. Francisco had changed the agreed-upon statement, which was supposed to be that the results were inconclusive. This created tension among the pathologists. After the press conference, I returned to the autopsy room. The team was still working, carefully collecting samples for further analysis. Dan Warlick stayed with the body, and later told me there was a sense of reverence and sadness during the entire process. I learned that 2 sets of samples were being prepared, one for the medical examiner and another for the hospital. The medical examiner's samples would be sent to the University of Tennessee Center for the Health Sciences, while the hospital's samples would go to Duckworth Laboratory at Methodist Hospital. On the way back to Graceland, Dean told me about the massive outpouring of grief at the mansion. The crowd was so large that they had to call in extra officers for crowd and traffic control. The only way to enter Graceland now was through the private rear gate. The confusion at Graceland had eased a bit, but the pain was still there, deep in everyone's hearts. Faces I knew well showed the hurt of a loss we hadn't seen coming, and didn't want to accept. I had planned to talk to Vernon about what I knew about Elvis's condition, but when I saw him watching the TV tributes from famous people, I couldn't bring myself to interrupt his moment of reflection on Elvis's life and legacy. That night, I headed home, knowing my family would be waiting with heavy hearts. Elvis was like family to us, my wife Edna, and our daughters, Chrissy, we called her Kissy, and Elaine. They had known Elvis almost as long as they could remember. Edna had a motherly influence on him, and he felt like a brother to me. Dean stayed at Graceland longer, trying to tie up loose ends. He was still working for the boss, and wanted everything to run smoothly for when Elvis came home. The next morning, I called Dean while getting ready for my hospital rounds and office work. "Have you heard more about the services?" I asked. "The viewing will be at the house from 3 to 5, Dean said. Vernon decided to hold the funeral at Graceland for security, and to make it easier on Grandma. Fans inside Graceland could be dangerous, I cautioned, remembering the chaos at concerts. A private service is best with all the celebrities coming. Otherwise, it could turn into a media circus. True, Dean said. The National Enquirer already has a helicopter circling Graceland, and Dick and Joe are handling the press. Elvis is coming home at noon, Dean added. Get to Graceland early to spend time with him. I also want to check on Vernon and Grandma. When I arrived at Graceland, the scene was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of fans surrounded the front gates, making the street impassable. Paramedics and the Red Cross were set up to help those who had been standing in the heat, without food or drink. The temperature was over 100 degrees, and some fans had fainted. The air was thick, with the scent of hundreds of floral wreaths and bouquets. Air National Guardsmen stood guard, a reminder that Elvis was not just a star, but a soldier who had served his country. I entered Graceland solemnly. Elvis lay in a copper casket in the marble foyer, under the crystal chandelier. I talked to him, imagining he was listening. I hope you can see this, I said, how much people love you. Elvis and I had a special bond. We both grew up in small towns, feeling the need to prove ourselves. He shared with me the pain of his father's imprisonment, and the hard times they faced. Church was a sanctuary for him, where he found his voice and his purpose. He served his country with pride, and his humility made him approachable despite his fame. He was kind, caring, and adventurous, making every moment with him special. Family, friends, and staff came to say their goodbyes. George Klein, Elvis's longtime friend, was there, handling the requests from celebrities. The fans who came to pay their respects were orderly and respectful, though many fainted from the heat and emotion. The next day, the living room was transformed for the funeral. Chairs replaced the furniture, and floral wreaths filled the space. The casket was placed between stained glass panels, with Elvis's piano nearby. The service opened with prayer and gospel music. I couldn't focus on the eulogies, only on how Elvis had brought gospel music to new places, spreading the word in his unique way. Vernon and Grandma were tired but resilient. I was honored to be a pallbearer, carrying Elvis to his final resting place. We placed his casket in the mausoleum, and Vernon spoke to Elvis one last time. Lisa Marie whispered goodbye to her daddy. It was over. We returned to Graceland, knowing Elvis would never walk through the door again. Edna spent time with Grandma, listening to her memories of Elvis. Dean pulled me aside, saying Vernon wouldn't make any personnel changes. He also mentioned Vernon asking if someone had killed Elvis, and reporters were investigating drugs. Elvis's story had taken a dark turn, and my life would soon follow. I remember the first time I met Elvis like it was yesterday. It was a chilly Sunday afternoon, February 26, 1967, and I was on call at the medical group. I was going through some mail when Charlie Hodge, a friend I met at a New Year's Eve party, called. He said Elvis, his good friend and employer, was in a lot of pain and needed a doctor. The usual physician was unavailable, so Charlie asked if I could make a house call. I suggested bringing Elvis to the office, but Charlie insisted it would be better if I came to Elvis's place. He said the car ride would make Elvis feel worse. So I headed to the Circle G Ranch in Walls, Mississippi, just a short drive from Graceland. When I arrived, Charlie led me to a trailer where Elvis was waiting. He greeted me with a warm smile and introduced me to Priscilla, his beautiful girlfriend at the time. After some friendly introductions, Elvis took me to a private room. He was embarrassed but needed help. He had been horseback riding and developed painful saddle sores and blisters. I treated him with a cool ointment and gave him some antibiotics. He was relieved, but still worried about an upcoming movie shoot. Before I left, Elvis asked if I could check on his grandma, Minnie Me, who had a history of heart disease. She lived at Graceland, so I agreed to stop by on my way back to Memphis. Minnie Me had a bronchial infection and asthma, and I left her with some prescriptions. When I got back to the ranch, Elvis called and asked me to return. He was worried about the movie shoot and didn't want to travel with his condition. He thought it would be expensive if he didn't show up on time, so he asked me to call his manager, Colonel Parker, to explain the delay. Parker wanted me to encourage Elvis to get to Hollywood as soon as possible. After I left, Elvis's team asked me to come back again. This time, Elvis wanted to show me his land. We drove around his 163 acres of beautiful fields. He seemed really relaxed and happy, sharing stories and showing his pride in the ranch. I realized he just wanted to talk to someone outside his usual circle. Before I left, Elvis thanked me for everything. It was a sincere and kind moment, and I told him that if he really wanted to thank me, he could let me go home. He laughed, and that was the start of our friendship. A few days later, I went back to Graceland to check on Elvis and give him some letters for the insurance company. He told me about his insomnia and his use of sedatives and amphetamine. I made sure to note any allergies, and he mentioned that codeine made him itch. We agreed that he could call me for any health issues when he was in Memphis. 3 months later, Elvis and Priscilla got married in Las Vegas. They were going to stay on the West Coast for his movie work. By Christmas, they were back at Graceland waiting for their baby. On February 1st, 1968, Elvis called me to say Priscilla was in labor. When I got to the hospital, Elvis was pacing the waiting room. He was so excited when his daughter, Lisa Marie, was born. He was grinning from ear to ear and couldn't believe it. After the baby arrived, we took some pictures, and I stayed with the happy parents for a while. Elvis was so excited, he forgot to hand out the cigars he brought. The next big emergency happened during a recording session in 1969. Elvis was working on a new album after his successful TV special. He came down with laryngitis and tonsillitis, and I left him some medicine. When I checked back, he had taken all the medicine in one day, thinking it would help him recover faster. I was shocked by his high tolerance for medication, but explained that it doesn't work that way. On July 31st, 1969, Elvis returned to live performances with a show at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. He was nervous about how his fans would react after being away for so long. He invited a lot of friends and celebrities to support him. The room was electric with anticipation. When Elvis stepped on stage, he was amazing. His charisma and voice were incredible, and the audience went wild. After the show, we celebrated in Elvis's hotel suite. He was thrilled with his performance and the new direction of his career. When Elvis came back to Vegas in 1970, he was already a star, but he still had a cold and was worried about his voice. The dry air in Las Vegas made it hard for him. He was glad to have a doctor nearby to help him before shows. His anxiety before each performance was intense, but once he stepped on stage, he transformed. The audience's energy fueled him, and he would be buzzing with excitement by the end of each show. Elvis's shows in Vegas were magical, and being part of it was an incredible experience. His performances were more than just music, they were a connection with his fans, and he always made everyone feel special. Parker saw a big chance to make Elvis even more famous. He booked Elvis to perform at the Texas Livestock Show in the Houston Astrodome. Before the show, we all sat in convertibles and drove around the football field. Elvis was smiling at everyone, but I could tell he was nervous. The place was huge, and he wondered how he could sing to so many people. The arena was smelly and the sound was bad, which made Elvis even more nervous. But when the show started, Elvis sang with all his heart. He broke all the records, selling out 6 shows in 3 days. It was a huge success, but it was also a lot of pressure for Elvis. When Elvis went back to Vegas, I started going there a few days early to help him prepare. I would stay for a while, and then go back to Memphis to treat my other patients. Elvis told me about a real and serious kidnapping threat. He was worried about his daughter, Lisa Marie, and added extra security around their home in Los Angeles. Elvis was really into the news, and he was scared by the violence he saw, like the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends by the Manson cult, and the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. He thought he might be a target too. Sometimes, people would try to rush the stage to get to Elvis. To help with this, he had special jackets made for his bodyguards and aides, so we could easily see where they were. But this also led to some problems, as some of the bodyguards were a bit too rough with the crowd. To feel safer, Elvis wanted us to get deputy sheriff badges, so we could carry guns. He even took us to police firing ranges to practice. He met a police officer named Dick Grob, who was a great shooter, and Elvis loved that. Elvis was really into police work. He would listen to police scanners, ride his motorcycle to crime scenes, and even give speeding tickets. The police found it funny, and they didn't mind too much, as long as Elvis didn't cause a scene. Elvis's life was getting more complicated. He was responsible for everything about his shows, from the costumes to the band to the choreography. The pressure was building up, and he wanted me around more often. He would ask me to come to California or wherever he was, saying he needed to talk about things he couldn't discuss over the phone. I realized that what he really needed was someone to listen to him and help him relieve the pressure. During his January engagement in 1971, Elvis got the flu and wasn't feeling well. I stayed in Vegas for a couple of weeks, but it was hard on my family and my practice. I had to leave my patients in the care of other doctors, which caused a lot of problems. Elvis understood, but it was still tough. One day in March, Elvis had a terrible pain in his eye and had to leave his recording session. The doctor in Nashville said Elvis needed to go to the hospital, but Elvis didn't want to. I called Dr. Spencer Thornton, who was one of my old professors, and he said it was serious. Dr. Thornton arranged for Elvis to stay at a hotel attached to the hospital, and I brought Dr. David Mayer, the top eye doctor in Tennessee, to see Elvis. When we got there, Dr. Mayer examined Elvis's eye and told him it was in really bad shape. The pressure in his eye was over 80, which is way too high. Dr. Mayer said we had to act fast, or Elvis could lose his vision in that eye. He explained that he could either make a hole in Elvis's iris, which is surgery, or give him a shot of steroids and dilate his eye. Elvis, being Elvis, tried to make a joke to ease the tension, but he was clearly in a lot of pain. Dr. Mayer asked if Elvis could sit still, and Elvis nodded. The room was tense, and I made sure everyone was quiet so Elvis and Dr. Mayer could focus. Barbara Lee, a beautiful actress who was there for support, held Elvis's hand. Dr. Mayer turned on a very bright light, which I knew would be hard for Elvis because he was so sensitive to light. Dr. Mayer explained that the needle would be very close to the parts of the eye that help you see, and there wasn't much room to work with. Everyone in the room was on edge, but Elvis stayed still. Dr. Mayer did the injection, and we all hoped it would help. Elvis and I had been through a lot together, and by 1973, the pressure was starting to show. The man who had conquered the world with his music and performances was now facing some of the toughest challenges of his life. Despite his incredible success, the grueling tour schedules, the demands of his fans, and the expectations placed on him were taking a toll. After the incredible success of the Elvis Aloha from Hawaii satellite show, where over 1 billion people watched him perform, Elvis seemed drained. The event was a historic moment, but it left him completely exhausted. He had poured everything he had into that performance, and it showed. But even after such a monumental achievement, there was no time to rest. The shows in Vegas were waiting, and the fans expected nothing less than perfection. When Elvis returned to Vegas, things didn't go well. His throat was bothering him, and the doctors advised him not to perform. This was hard for him to accept. He was so used to giving his all, and the thought of disappointing his fans was almost too much to bear. He became agitated and even went totally wild. After a misunderstanding with some excited fans, Linda had to call the hotel doctor to sedate him. The next few days were tough, with the doctor checking on him frequently. I couldn't help but feel worried. This wasn't the Elvis I knew. When that troubled Vegas engagement finally ended, Elvis didn't want to leave. His team was ready to go home, but he stayed behind. I started getting more calls from him, and each time, he sounded more stressed and exhausted. He was canceling shows in Vegas, and I heard he was under the care of multiple doctors. I was busy with my patients in Memphis, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. The grueling schedule was definitely part of the problem. Performing 2 shows a night, both in Vegas and on the road, was pushing him to his limits. When we talked on the phone, I could hear the frustration in his voice. He was a man who always wanted to give his best, but his body was starting to betray him. The pressure was mounting, and it was taking a toll on his health and his spirit. Despite everything, Elvis still had moments of pure magic. When he was on stage, he could transform from a tired, stressed man into the king of rock and roll. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Fans didn't always see the toll it was taking, but we did. His performances were still incredible, but the cost was high. Elvis was a man who cared deeply about his fans and his work. He wanted to be the best and to make everyone happy. But sometimes, even the strongest of us need a break. I could only hope that he would find a way to slow down and take care of himself before it was too late. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Elvis needed more than just a rest. He needed peace, and he needed to find a way to enjoy the life he had built without the constant pressure. As I watched from a distance, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the man who had once been the center of the world. But one thing was certain. Elvis Presley was more than just a performer. He was a legend, and his story was far from over.